Congratulations, by the way, about the book deal in Sri Lanka. That must be really exciting to see your book coming out in Sri Lanka.
Yeah,
Has that already happened? Or?
No, it's coming out in January. And that obviously is very exciting. It's a very well-respected publishing house there, and it's the first time in their history that they haven't acquired an original work, but they're republishing a work from elsewhere.
What are they called again?
They're called Pereira Hussein.
That's right. I met the publishers.
Yes,
As
that's
a
right.
husband and wife couple.
A husband and wife combination. Yeah, they're lovely people. And in fact, the book cover there looks radically different. It's a different market, of course. So instead of this elegant autumnal scary crow, it's a picture of this kind of swaggering tough right out of a romance novel, and it's kind of this sepia-colored. It looks very much like a high-end romance novel, and I'm okay with that.
Now, although you will have more readers in Sri Lanka, to date, your readers would primarily have been in Canada, the U.S., perhaps Europe. And I wanted to ask, since many or most of these readers will not be familiar with Sri Lanka, did you feel that this lack of familiarity on the part of your most likely readers posed any challenges for you as an artist? And did you worry in writing, or do you worry what the reader knows about the world you're describing? Does it matter what the reader knows before encountering your work?
Well, I can answer that two ways. The first is to suggest that when I told my father that this book was coming out, and he asked me what it was about, and I told him, he said, "Why would people in Canada want to read about Sri Lanka?" It didn't make any sense to him, and so I pointed out that he likes to watch movies set in California, and I won that war. But I think the more profound idea, I think, would be that writing should be able to take you anywhere. And if you drill down far enough, you will find universals of human experience. I mean, what do we know about Oxford, Mississippi? Very little, but for Faulkner, right? What do we know about Dublin? But until Joyce, in many ways, reimagined it for us, or brought it to life for us. And so there's a conflict, because I could have written this in a way as more of a documentary type fiction, where it's educating the reader about Sri Lanka. But this is not a book about Sri Lanka. This is a book about Sam Kandy, about one man trying against his fate to make something of himself in a world that tells him he's nothing.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, Sam's story, well, I have a couple observations, but let me just invite you to tell the audience. Tell us about Sam Kandy, the protagonist of this sprawling novel. It, by the way, spreads over the entire lifetime, 100-year lifetime of Sam Kandy, beginning around 1900 and ending around 1999. So this novel follows Sam and his country for the 20th century. Well, but tell us a bit about him.
Well, he's born in a village in the middle of Sri Lanka, in the Kandy region, in 1899. And he's born Buddhist to a bad horoscope. As a result, he's, as it were, fated to a life of no good. His horoscope reading is that he has 4 empty houses, which means that he'll come to no good end in life. And so, as I've learned through research, back then, if you were a Sri Lankan family and you had a child who was born to this kind of negative fate, one way to deal with him is you drop him at the temple. You kind of give him over to the Buddhist temple, and he becomes a boy monk. And so this is what happens to Sam Kandy, and he hates it. He absolutely hates it. And after 3 years, he escapes. He makes his way down to Colombo, where he becomes something of a street hustler in Petta, which is sort of the great bustling market in Colombo. And from there, he jumps a ship to Australia. He goes to Australia and becomes a man of some means. He has a bunch of adventures in Australia, falls in love with an Australian girl. Made a brief reference to that in the reading. It doesn't work out. He goes to Singapore, hustles there for a while, has some encounters with a girl, doesn't really work out, then comes back to Sri Lanka, and he's trying to become something of a man about town in Colombo as a shipping agent, basically. And he's kind of wheeling and dealing, but it's not enough. There's something that you want, that Sam wants very much, which is sort of hometown recognition. And it's something I'll admit that I very much identify with, as I've told my friends, I can write for the New York Times, but the Oshawa This Week will not return my phone calls. The world doesn't make sense in that sense, right? I mean, I don't understand how that can be. But really, the Oshawa This Week won't return my phone calls. But anyway, you want a certain amount of recognition in your hometown and where you're from. And so Sam gets this by bringing a motor car to his hometown, the first one ever to show up in this place in 1929. And out of that, he marries a girl. They have 2 children. The marriage doesn't work out for various reasons. He marries a second woman. It's a more tempestuous relationship. That one doesn't work out. And then he's kind of at his end. And then he's found by a third woman who falls in love with him basically in spite of himself. And together, the 2 of them have 14 children together and live happily ever after. And the village itself goes from being this kind of backwater place in the middle of the country to a thriving tourist attraction by the end of his life.
Sam is born kind of in the middle of nowhere in a nondescript village of a poor and lazy man. He reinvents himself, and he even creates a new name for himself, Sam Kandy. And people don't like that. He's constantly challenged about his name. Who the hell do you think you are? And what's your real name? And who are you really? And his biggest secret is who he is.
Yes.
This is a novel really about reinvention. And I should mention, for the benefit of those who've come out tonight, that your first novel is also really a novel about reinvention. And in Governor of the Northern Province, Sam Bokhari is an ex-African warlord trying to reinvent himself in Ottawa, where he's working in a convenience store. So you're very interested in this concept of reinvention, of kind of recreation of oneself. And I'm wondering if you might talk about that as a kind of an underlying obsession in this book, and in your work.
Why would a kid who grew up in Oshawa drinking Tim Hortons want to reinvent himself now that he wears these glasses and drinks fair trade coffee in Toronto? I don't understand where it comes from, but I think the tension of reinvention is what I find most compelling, because, in fact, you can't reinvent yourself, right?
You've got to come back.
You always come back. There's always that kind of tension between. I think this is universal. I think we could all find a way to explain this right now. There is the tension between who you believe you are, who the world recognizes you as such, and in the space in between, there's so much excitement, worry, anxiety, and in some ways, again, I think that's universal to the human experience. Your sense of self and then others' sense of you, and the interaction between those 2 kinds of selves. It's a kind of, the challenge is what I would describe perhaps as a unity in tension, right? How do all of these pieces connect together? And for Sam Kandy, this is probably one of the great challenges for him, is how to hold this together, because he needs to. It's a lot like Don Draper in Mad Men. The same kind of tension of somebody who's very successful in the world, but is harboring a great secret, and it takes so much effort on his part to hold his life together. Tony Soprano as well.
It's a bit like passing. It's a bit like the racial phenomenon of passing from being black to white, if you can pull it off. But that passing comes with a great tension, because if you're found out, if you're found out to have slipped from being black into white, if you could pull that off, then your life will fall apart. And so Sam, even the people closest to him, even his wives, do not know, and he refuses to divulge, who he really is to his wives. And interestingly, I found one of the most telling moments in his second marriage is that when his wife sees him drinking water from some kind of public tap.
Yes.
In the way that he's drinking water, like a poor homeboy, with his palm flat or something, kind of reveals to her, he's a village boy. Like he comes from nowhere, just because of the way he's drinking water out of this public tap. And it's like a moment of discovery for her.
Well, and I think it's those exact kind of moments, I think, in many ways, that reveal the constancy of the human person, right? That he's this flashy guy in a pinstripe suit who's driving this fancy car, and then when he's thirsty, he drinks like a poor little village boy, and he's unconscious, someone who's so obsessed with who he is and with the image he's projecting everywhere, but then in these unguarded moments, he does this and drinks and oddly, this is in many ways how writers work, I guess. I saw that image because of one of my brothers-in-law who's from Mexico City and grew up probably rather poor, lower middle class in Mexico City, and now he's kind of a standard issue suburban guy in northern Wisconsin. But we were moving into a house in Notre Dame when my wife and I lived in Notre Dame for a little while. He saw us move, and then he got thirsty, and I went to give him, a Nalgene bottle like normal people drink out of, and he went, "No, don't worry about it," and just went like this. And I was surprised, and his wife would have been horrified if she'd seen it. And I kind of tucked that away, and I brought it back out for this.
Yeah, it's a great image. We could talk about Beggar's Feast for a long time, but I'd wanted to leave some questions for others if there are. But let me just move quickly, since your work covers such a broad span. You're currently writing a biography of Richard John Newhouse, one of the most, as you mentioned in your article in the Walrus, one of the most influential Canadian-born intellectuals in American life in the last 40 years. Comparable in stature, you mentioned John Kenneth Galbraith, a Lutheran minister who becomes a Roman Catholic priest, marched with Martin Luther King and advised George W. Bush, near the center of American politics for several decades. Tell us a bit about Richard John Newhouse and your interest in him in writing this biography.
Well, the interest came out of, I think, probably the productive intersection of my scholarly work at Ryerson, where I'm a professor of American studies, and then my work in journalism for the Walrus, and then the fact that I also write reviews for any number of different venues, including one of the magazines that he founded, a magazine called First Things. And what struck me about his life story was that in addition to everything that Larry just said, he also wrote 30 books and wrote a 12,000-word column every single month for 20 years for a magazine he founded, and advised every president from Lyndon Baines Johnson all the way to George W. Bush, every single one. I mean, this was a remarkable man, and he was born in Pembroke, Ontario, of all places. And it's just, in many ways, I guess, another example of a remarkable series of inventions or reinventions, and yet there were always constancies. And for him, the constancy was he was first and foremost a man of God, and it was always the challenge of aligning his first principles, his belief and commitment to God, with his very active political and cultural life. And so for all of those reasons, it's just it's a rich life story. I mean, I can think of few people in the last 40 years who you could say they literally were marching beside Dr. King, and they were literally sitting with George W. Bush advising him to run for president. I mean, Newhouse might literally be the only person we could say that about in terms of that remarkable trajectory. He dated Joan Baez in the 60s. I mean, the man had a remarkable life.
You read a lot of reviews, and I know that some Canadian reviewers, especially if they're also Canadian novelists, they prefer to review only non-Canadian books.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how you manage that. Do you review Canadian works or only works by writers outside Canada? How do you manage that?
I'll take on anything and everything that they'll give me for $1 a word, I happily will review. In fact, the way I got my start, in part, was because I was asked to review a couple of Canadian novels about 5 or 6 years ago when I was a postdoc student at Notre Dame. And the idea was, you're not from here, and so you're not implicated in the little Toronto scene, so you're going to be a little freer in what you're willing to say about these books. I was very free. I was enthusiastically free, in fact, about those two particular novels. And I think it's sort of a piece. It's necessary service for writers to engage with other writers' works in various venues, obviously, and to evaluate. That's the purpose of criticism. I mean, I interviewed Mavis Gallant for The Walrus a few years ago, and she had a very straightforward understanding of what it means to be a book reviewer. You have to tell your readers, should you buy this book? Like this remarkable intellect, Mavis Gallant, had this very practical understanding of the service that a book review does. And so I understand it in the same terms, but it's also a way to kind of clear one's own meanings, right? I mean, about what's going on in a book. Why isn't this book working? Why is it working? In terms of how that plays against your own sense of things.
It's one thing to take on a book and to sort of engage with it critically and to poke at it here and there and criticize it, but it's another to decimate a book in a review, isn't it? It must be hard, like, if you can't stand a book, and being a novelist yourself, it's very hard to write those reviews, isn't it?
Not always, but yes. Sometimes it is very hard. Sometimes I have to admit, especially with what I would describe as sort of big fish, where they've clearly just sort of put out another book. I mean, I love Salman Rushdie. I interviewed him here a year ago, but there are passages of his fiction that are verbatim from book to book sometimes. And in fact, I ripped apart one of his books a few years ago, and I was terrified a year ago in this very place that he was going to have noticed it. Well, that's just remarkable vanity on my part, of course. At the end of the interview, he said, "Thanks so much, Roy," and he left. But, but anyway, I think again, it's necessary, right, to call out a bad book when it is in fact a bad book. I have to admit, I was pretty nervous about the reviews for for Beggar's Feast, because I've made probably more than a few enemies with the reviews I've written, but I've been very, very happily surprised and flattered by the response by the critics.